Addiction never affects just the addict. It affects all of us. Recovering from addiction and alcoholism is also a life-changing battle for families dealing with a loved one's addiction. Numerous programs support addicts as they reclaim their lives, while their families face their own challenges without the same guidance. You're listening to Voices in Courage with KL Wells, where we transform the lives of the families and loved ones of addicts and alcoholics from surviving to thriving in the midst of chaos. Tune in as we highlight vulnerable stories of families who have addicted relatives and friends and learn how they have dealt with the challenges of isolation, desperation, and shame. If you are seeking ways to live your best life, then we welcome you into this safe space. Be a part of change today with your host, KL Wells.
Good morning. I'm KL Wells with the Voices in Courage podcast, and I am thrilled again to bring Jim Horton back to our podcast. We had such a powerful conversation the first time, and he's just a delightful man and has been on an extraordinary journey and continues to explore and do this journey that we call life in the midst of the world of addiction. And so I'm going to have him tell you a little bit of the background, and then we're going to talk about some things that we talked about prior to getting on with you all today. So Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you again.
Awesome. Thanks, KL. Thanks so much for having me on again. I always so much I get so much out of our conversations whenever I leave. And that's kind of how I feel about our discussions, as they're really just conversations. My story, it's been 3 years now since my son passed. I lost my son, Zach, to an accidental overdose. He was just 6 months out of high school. And it was just the journey for myself and my wife. Early on, we wanted to just understand and contemplate how we could have missed it. How did something that big happen and we were that disconnected, and we're just in such denial. And again, we narrowed that down to what we term as the stigma of addiction.
Yeah, and
that became the mission of our foundation, was to break that stigma of addiction. And and then that leads me to where to almost like our discussion earlier today. It's like how the grieving process of losing someone, the recovery process of working through, I think that process with Zach when he was around, I think there's so much that I didn't understand then that I'm beginning to understand now. And I tell you, what we had talked about earlier is that challenge that I feel in changing the way that I think, of accepting something new. It's different than I had anticipated. I think we like to understand that, hey, we kind of know what's going on. That's why I believe what I believe, because I know what it is. It's developed over this lifetime of knowledge and the path that I've walked. And then all of a sudden I stop and I ask myself, well, is that as true for me today as it was even just last year,
right,
or before? And I think maybe if I had done some more of that challenging, early on in my relationship with Zach, if I had been willing to think that way, it may have been different. At least it would have been different for me, right? And how it related. And that's kind of, I think, what I'm shooting for now, is just to understand, but it's just a complicated road.
Yeah, I mean, when we talked earlier, as we are now, just giving a name to the thought-provoking process that you're in the midst of right now is really powerful. I firmly believe, I know this has been my journey too, and I'm assuming that a lot of people that are listening to this podcast today is, if we're awake for our lives and we continue to stay awake and be on this journey, we're going to learn along the way things from other people and life experience and books and podcasts that challenge us to re-examine what we thought we knew previously. And so I'm just used to that. And although I know there are certain things that I do believe, and I believe in love, and I believe in people's unfolding journeys, and I believe that life can be an extraordinary adventure. Those things I'm not going to like give up, but there are things about this disease and who I was and who I'm becoming, and that are forever unfolding. So
KL, what do you think is the protagonist? What is it is it just my, and I mean, I speak of me collectively, in society, and then, myself, but is it our egos? Is it my ego that makes me want to believe that, what I have is so right that I can't view anything else? And then that's why I get, because I don't want that to be there, but there's something that keeps me that keeps me stuck sometimes, and creates that anxiety when change is getting ready to happen. What is that about?
Well, I think that's just the human condition, Jim. And it is ego, from my understanding, is that, I mean, there's a thing called the 4 fatal fears, and one of them is being wrong. And so some of us hang our hats on, we must be right. And because if we're not, we're fearful of what that might mean, on so many levels. And so we hang on to that being right at the detriment to ourselves and to others. And so I think it's a courageous act to re-examine what we thought we knew and reflect on, how did we come to this conclusion? Is it our conclusion? Was it what we picked up from our families, our communities, the world? Does it really resonate with my soul and my spirit? All of those questions are super rich, and so that's how I think about this nagging, thought-provoking journey piece, is that there's a part of us that is just wired for progression, and continuing to explore. And so I think that's the part that's kind of nagging at you. It fuels me. And then that nervousness that you spoke to at the edge of, I think that for me has been a muscle to grow, to calm the nervousness, and just to allow it to become whatever it's meant to become. There's a for me, there's a kind of a faith, that I'm about ready to pop a new understanding, or birth a new understanding, or see the world a little differently. And the way that I frame it for myself and people that I work with is, it's like a kaleidoscope. You just change it just a little bit, and poof, the world looks different. And so,
and that I resonate with a lot of what you're saying there. And here's something we had talked about earlier, getting to that point of being able to be open and accept it. The challenge with that, when I'm living in my everyday life, is I'm still surrounded by the same pressures, right? That were there all the time. And so my mind has found a comfortable routine that is stable, that doesn't allow itself to get to be free. And what I was saying to you is that, I traveled over to the coast, and I'm in my little fifth wheel RV, and I haven't seen any news in 3 or 4 days. I've really been kind of detoxing, if you will, from and just a lot's been going on the last month with work. And so all of a sudden I find my day, now, day 2, day 3, just my mind is relaxed enough where I can start to consider some of those things and think of it differently. Otherwise, I believe our ego, our defense mechanisms, that are there, when I start to challenge something, if it just shuts it off immediately, I don't have to expend any energy, any energy chasing that down. Right. And now I'm able just to kind of be open and let some of that take place.
Well, I think that's one of the crazy things about the world that we live in, is there are so many freaking distractions to keep us from these moments that you're speaking about. The news, work, people, all kinds of things that are that are kind of designed to distract us from knowing that we have or are going to know or are going to explore. If we're busy all the time, if we don't allow new information in, if we listen to the news and, go down that rabbit hole in terms of life sucks and then you die, we are more powerful than we give ourselves credit for. And the courage that it takes to create the space of 3 or 4 or more days that you're doing right now so that your mind can calm, you can almost like energetically detox.
Yes.
So that you can get back to the truth of who you really, truly are, which is this amazing spirit and bright light in the world. I mean, I love your smile because it comes from inside out, man. That's it right there. And that's who you really are. And so to be able to take care of that kind of energy, it takes work.
Yes.
And I know we had talked last time a little bit about the whole notion of self-care. And you're like, never occurred to me, when we were in the throes with Zach. And so it doesn't stop ever.
Right.
You have big work in the world that was born out of your experience with Zach, and self-care is a component of doing that work. So
and everything, isn't interesting. Of probably 50% of all the books I read last year, there was an element of that in there. That is a theme over the last decade of just writings that comes into, regardless of what you're doing, they touch on that. Right. And what that sounds like, if it's eating well, if it's exercise, if it's meditation, if it's yoga, whatever that means.
Yeah. And so I have taken it on personally, as you are too, to design what that looks like for me, that restores and recharges me so I can do my work in the world. And so one of the things I wanted to touch on today was this whole notion of thriving. And, there's a mindset component to thriving, and then there's a belief component to thriving, and then there's a behavioral component to thriving. And what I found is that number one is giving ourselves permission to thrive. And what does that actually mean?
Yeah, because I think for some of us, either we don't believe we deserve good things to a point, or again, I believe that just that question that hit me hard. Do I believe that I have the right to thrive? I want to thrive on Zach's behalf, but I mean, they're still in my grieving process. There's still some guilt that I'm, dealing with. And then I'm sure too, and how we were raised and how we were thought of to think of as what success was or what goodness is. Is it a negative? All of those things come into play. But,
yeah. I mean, we grew up in a very similar time, and I'm a little bit older, but nobody talked about thriving. Nobody talked about taking care of themselves. I mean, honestly, in the world that I grew up in, everybody was self-medicating, so, and that was the best you could do, kind of to take care of yourself was have a drink at the end of the day and relax. So, yeah.
Well, I think that's interesting. I never once remember my parents ever talking about being happy or thriving. Happiness wasn't. It was survival for they both had lived through the Depression, right? So their mindset, which was I'm sure passed on to me in a great amount, was really just about survival. So thriving didn't even have that wasn't even on the radar,
Right. Yeah.
If I want to ask, what is it like to, that would be, the whole concept and of that time of just doing more, because an internal joy really didn't come into play.
No, it was not part of the times. I do think that as the baby boomers have aged, that there has been a revelation in our own understanding of how we wanted to age, what thriving in our elder years might look like, sound like, and feel like. We've been through a lot at this point. We have a lot of wisdom. We want to do it differently than our parents or our grandparents. And so how do we take control of our ability to thrive in the midst of the chaos that's swirling around us? Because that's what you kind of touched on a little bit ago was, there's all this stuff going on around us, and it tends to impact who we are in the moment. Something shows up from a situational perspective outside of us, and we kind of we react to that thing. And I think more of our work for those of us who are really working to impact our families, our communities, our worlds, it's super important, at least for me, to center up and be the calm in the storm from a truly authentic and genuine place. And so that's part of where my personal work is at this point. And so paying attention to thriving as a thing to orient to, and knowing what the elements are of when I'm thriving, this is what it looks like, sounds like, and feels like, and that I'm actually in more agency of making that happen than, anybody else.
Right, right.
So.
Well, and it's so nice to be able to give a different, in the recovery realm, being able to give a different voice, just different information. Mm-hmm. It's been so narrow for so long, mm-hmm. So to be able to expand that. So, boy, it almost sounds like whenever you dig in a little deeper to the thriving concept, there's some stretching in there. There's some work that's involved with it too, right? There's an uncomfortableness that may precipitate, those periods of growth, and that's that challenging of new ideas and to let that grow. But and I think that's exactly what I'm feeling right now. Mm-hmm. Is I'm entering that, and I just don't know. Of course, I want the known. I want to be in control, right? And so, letting go of that a little bit and just letting that happen is, it's going to be interesting.
Well, and there may be a redefinition of what control actually means.
Yeah, well, in some of the reading that I'm doing in a book that you had recommended, when it talks about control, and then there's that control paradigm that has a lot of negativity attached to it. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, my ability to control my routine or establish good habits, mm-hmm. and so there's the positive part of it that I want to hang on to, and just even understanding that how much of that is a good thing, and when it's a good thing for me, then I want to push that off on everyone else too, and maybe that's not what I need to do is, if it's whatever the discussion is share the ideas as of something of openness, and that's that discussion I want to start, instead of it just closing down, instead of whatever it is we're talking about saying, no, this is what I have to believe, so now you have to believe it my way, which is kind of my way of, that's how I've been taught to communicate.
Yeah. And so just this notion of, I used to think that if they just knew, they would do it differently. And then I laugh about it now, because I woke up one day and I was like, look how many people smoke. And so there's all these things that say that is just a silly belief. And so I think, okay, so I am going to embody and be a model for the things that I do believe. And I'm going to ask a lot of questions. I'm going to poke the bear, so to speak, as to what is thriving, and how do you know when you're thriving? And is it something that you want to orient to or not? Can you even conceive of thriving in the midst of all that's going on? And I've had numerous of people say to me, there's no way. it's just too crazy. Or, my son's addicted. There's no way I can thrive while I have a child who's addicted. And so I think, part of what we're doing today is, just poking at these beliefs of I believe I can thrive in the midst of my son's addiction. Even in the toughest of times. And so what does that mean? And so I'm coupling this, Jim, with this. Both of us are very wedded to this notion of shattering the stigma that comes with this disease. And, because of the stigma and the judgment and the shame, so many people are silent in the midst of this. Yeah.
And that's a conversation that just has to be open. And here's something, KL, that I've been wanting to redefine for myself, a little bit, as the foundation now is in its third year. And, and when I first started out tying the denial, piece to, ending the stigma of addiction was strong for me. And now I see that message kind of, it's kind of morphing to where now I really do. I want to start a discussion, but I want to now define what that means. So, and at some point, I think just people talking about it is gonna bring voice, and then that, as more people talk about it, different ideas will come out. That is always a positive thing. I want to be able to share that concept more easily with people and define what that means, for me, again, and what is that like when I say, well, I want us to have a conversation? Because we're having a conversation in the news and it's all negative. If it's only about a border, if it's only about what other people are doing to us, then that's going to be a limiting conversation, right?
Right.
So,
yes.
So I want to get the conversation going, but it's got to have some kind of positive momentum.
Well, if we're shattering stigma, then what are we creating?
Creating understanding. Right? We're leaning more into the facts of what substance use disorder is, instead of the fairy tales and just the salacial stories.
So we're willing to redefine what we thought we knew,
right,
about addiction, and what now is emerging as, I'm just taking one thing. Is that so much of addiction is tied to childhood trauma.
Yes.
And that,
I was just saying, we really have to, if we're going to end the stigma of addiction, we need to throw mental health in there too.
yes.
Because the stigma surrounding mental health issues, and again, what trauma is, what the trauma that you or I experience may be different than somebody else's, but just understanding that it doesn't have to be graded on my scale. Right. For me to get that, that's a.
Yeah. Well, that is another notion. Dr. Gabor Mehta, who wrote the recent book, was The Myth of Normal, which is a brilliant read. But what he talks about is, trauma isn't necessarily tied to the event that took place for us, as much as it's tied to our meaning that we made out of that event. And so that's like, whoo, okay, I have to think about that for a little bit. Because like you said, there's no grade for, I had more trauma than you had, or, what I went through was more traumatic than what you went through. Although a lot of people play that game. But there are things that take place in our growing up and our lives that we define as traumatic, and we make meaning of, and we make decisions out of that definition of trauma that informs and influences us in a way that doesn't serve us in a lot of ways.
No, I see that. Yeah. And just being, being able for myself to see that and give some, when I look back into my childhood and I think of, when we grew up in an environment, that's our experience, right? And so when you're young, you just think everybody has the same kind of experience, right?
Right.
So
Exactly.
now I look back as I'm older now, and I can see, and I know that I really need to dig a little deeper if I start making excuses for something that happened when I was a child. I didn't have any control over it, and so that's probably an area that I need to look at, a little closer. And it's amazing that I can still benefit from that, even at my age now, right?
Yeah.
It's something that, and I think, sometimes there are folks, Kale, especially as they get older in life, and they think, well, I've just lived with this already for this long. Why, why do any more work? But I'm just now, finding some of the answers and, and some of the direction to find some of those answers. So.
Yeah. And I applaud your journey on this. And I'm a big believer in when life feels like it's falling apart, it's actually falling together. And that's just kind of trained on my part into the way that I think about things. But there's a really powerful question that I lean into when in the darkest of times, which is, what are the gifts and lessons or opportunities embedded in this moment? And again, I say this through the lens of, this is a trained question for me to ask myself in the darkest of times. And because I've trained myself to do it, it's a very strong muscle. And so it works for me, because I can flip out of, quote, the darkness of the trauma pretty quickly into, okay, what are the gifts, lessons, and opportunities embedded in this moment? And there always are. And I've done it enough times that's why I have this really strong muscle along those lines. And so I throw that out there as just one way to kind of approach life and living, because we're always going through stuff.
Right. Well, now, Kale, in retrospect, I'll be able to ask that question. But you're able to get there in the moment. Right? What's the first? Give us like the first step of. I mean, obviously, I want to do that. But what are some triggers, or what did you use as kind of the baby steps leading up to being able to? Oh, I see this happening now. What can I learn from it? As opposed to me lamenting what took place and saying, what can I learn from it for next time?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question, because that kind of pokes at this notion of, how do we retrain our brains? How do we rewire our neural pathways to get stronger outcomes that actually serve us at a higher level? And what I would say is, my experience has been focus and intentionality to do that, which, like, I have things built into my phone in the alarm, in the alarms, you can put sayings. So for like 10 years, I had a saying in there that went off 4 times a day that said, I'm amazing, inspiring, and courageous.
Wow.
And so I just leaned into that and continued to lean into it. And my day starts with love, serve, impact. And so it's like wired in my brain. So I'll give you an example real quick. This was about 6 years ago. I'm a backpacker, and the number one thing that kills people in the backcountry is drowning. And so we were crossing a river we had no business crossing, and I almost drowned. And in the midst of that moment, obviously I lived. So as soon as I got out of the water, I'd gotten my backpack off, my backpacking partner had taken my backpack off. I got out of the water. I checked my body to make sure I didn't have any broken bones, but I also knew that I was subject to shock.
Right.
And so I get up, I check my body. We're about 1.5 miles in, so we could hike back to the truck. And I put my backpack on, and immediately my brain went to, what are the gifts and lessons embedded in this experience? And I did that mantra all the way back to the truck. And I leaned into that mantra for the next 2-3 days. And so because I did that, because I had trained myself to do that in the midst of just coming out of the river and almost drowning, I dropped right into it. And so I know it can be done. And it changed my experience completely. Whereas my backpacking partner carried guilt for months afterwards because she didn't want to talk about it. And I'm living in what are the gifts and lessons embedded in this? And there were so many for me. I was living in this. That was an amazing, extraordinary experience. It wasn't that I almost drowned and the terror of that. This was a life-changing trajectory experience that forever changed who I am in the world. And it gave me an opportunity in real time to practice that. What are the gifts and lessons embedded in it?
Wow. I like that.
Yeah. So I tell that story actually quite often for people to, like, if I can do that, so can you. And every time I tell the story, it wires it in my brain. And I surround myself with podcasts, books, and people that believe that this is true. So it anchors it as a truth for me. So I just gave you a number of different things to do that actually can anchor that kind of belief into our brains over a period of time. It's not a one and done.
Right. Well, and that's what I like what you said. And see, these are things, again, as I get older, because I know I don't have to do these anymore. But, when I was early in my sales career, I had a little Post-it note on my mirror in the morning, right? Mm-hmm. That was my affirmation, that I would say, why not set my watch 4 times a day just to recall, what has happened that I can learn from today, just to shock my mind out of, hey, this is the way you've always done it. Just for a moment, just stop. What new has come up? I love that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's similar to, there's a whole thriving gratitude movement at this point, end of day, 3 things you're grateful for. I mean, seriously, the research has already shown if you just do that on a regular basis, it changes the trajectory of your life, because you start to look for the things to be grateful for throughout your day. So you have things to report at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So we all have.
And again, imagine how difficult this is when you live in a world, though, bombarded by the news, and again, the most salacial negative impact that can take place. Right. Is what grabs that. Yeah. And to be able to not have that be my default and my go-to.
It is clearly a focused, intentional decision to move in the directions that I'm talking about here, other than just to stay in the river of this is just how it is, and I'm flowing with everybody else. I don't want to do that. I'm kind of wired to be contrarian and a disruptor, and I have a higher intention for my life that I want to be able to feel the joy and be grateful more often than not. And
so, Kale, but let me ask you, because you're a coach. This is also your job. So you're fortunate enough to get to practice. Right. And all that time you're practicing, you're also training and you're teaching. So, and you obviously practice this in your personal life too. It's not just about the coaching. Is there a difference for Kale, though, the coach, and Kale, the personal person? Does she struggle? I mean, even though it is what can I learn from this, right in the midst of the, that was a great example of that. It has become embedded in who you are. But do you feel like you're coaching yourselves, or now do you just get to be you and it's a natural flow of who you are?
At this point, I mean, I'm still, working on perfecting my edges and learning and doing thought-provoking things. I'm always learning. So I haven't perfected, I'm not done by any stretch of the imagination, and I don't ever see myself as done. So, but what I will say is, kind of speak to the question is, what's today? Tuesday. So last Thursday evening, I got a call from my son's girlfriend saying that he has relapsed. And so what I would say is, and we've been through this so many times, is my lows are lower and in the midst of this journey. So I know how to navigate it. And I was like, take a deep breath, do the things that I know I need to do to take care of myself, knowing that my heart is a little sad right now, that he's still in the midst of this. And given the fact that we're in this fentanyl horse tranquilizer world that we're living in, where anybody who's recreationally using drugs can drop like that, much less somebody who's an addict.
Right.
Is that my son's living in Russian roulette, every part of his day. And so I talked to my wife that night because she was out of town. I'm at home. I was home alone. And I said, this is what's going on. We both, cried. And then I said, I'm going to do what I know I need to do to take care of myself. So I'm up at 5 o'clock the next morning. I do my workout. I have great meetings throughout the day. I fill my cup. And then I also have a very clear visualization in my head of the life that I live is extraordinarily blessed. I have amazing clients. I have an amazing marriage. I have amazing friends. I get to do this like with you right now. I mean, what a gift. I mean, a pinch me, kind of thing. And then there's this part with Sam. Well, he is a much smaller bubble than the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm.
He's 32 at this point. He's an adult. And so I had a podcast dad say to me, his son said to him, the greatest gift you can give me, Dad, is to do your work. I'm doing my work.
Yeah.
So now what I would say is that time frame is much shorter now. Talk on Thursday night, Friday morning, I'm hitting it. Whereas it used to be weeks, or just this would be this underlying in the background worry and angst. And are we going to get the phone call today? Which is such a disempowering question. So yeah, I've been there. And I have retrained myself again, very intentionally, very much from a focused place to stay in thriving. I pulled out my grid that's actually in my book, The 5 Acts of Courage, which is crisis, struggling, surviving, and thriving. And I went through each one of those verticals again, and I pulled out my SAGE material and I read all of that again, so I refocused my brain in terms of thriving and self-care and what was going to serve the most, not just me, but the circumstances and the situation.
Well, I love that whole process. When you, Kale, do you hold seminars about your book and walk people through those processes, or is that a part of what you do in your individual coaching stuff?
Well, I definitely do it in my individual coaching stuff. The book has actually just been birthed, and it's on Amazon, but we haven't done, kind of the launch stuff yet. But I've been working with this one thing that actually came out of the National Fallen Firefighters Association, of this grid that I'm talking about, from crisis to thriving. I've been working with that for a few years now. So I'm not in the throes yet of doing the seminars and all the things. There's a whole bunch of things to come along those lines. So
yeah, well, I mean, it just sets up so well for that,
Mm-hmm.
and something that that can be tracked along. It is a pathway to success for sure.
Yes, and we need more models of people who are shifting from crisis to struggling to surviving to thriving, even in the midst of it. Because in the midst of this disease, thriving, which is, from a brain science perspective up here, which allows us to make better decisions. It allows us clarity. It gives us more possibilities to work with, all of the good things as far as our being able to operate at a more optimum level. comes from that place of calm and peace and thriving. It doesn't come from crisis, which is down here, which washes our bodies in cortisol, the stress hormone. And so I want to be more optimally operating, certainly in this moment, not just for myself, but for my family and for my community. And yes, I am also blessed that every day I get to meet with people and train and coach on this, which that's also kind of designed, Jim, any coach will tell you they coach the things that they most need to embrace and learn themselves. If we're honest about it. And so that's another way for me to keep myself awash in what I know to be true about thriving and what works. And so, and I get to experience this with so many people in watching their own transformations out of crisis towards thriving. So what a gift.
Yeah. How rewarding.
Yeah.
For sure.
Pinch me now. So similar to what you're doing, Jim, with your foundation is you're giving people a different way to look at this disease. And you are convening conversations that matter. And hopefully you just need one person to change their perspective on stigma, on this disease, and one person can affect potentially hundreds. So we're just in different parts of the river, in terms of our journeys. And each one of us are showing up every day to create a different knowing and a different unfolding for lots of people. So, and so I applaud you in this journey, because it does take courage to show up every day and do this work from a heart space, a spiritual space, a mental and emotional space, and a physical space, and much less challenge yourself to rethink what you thought you knew.
Yeah, I think that's still the scariest part, but it's also interesting. I know that's where the growth is going to happen, is out there, right? So
yes,
keep pushing along.
So make sure, this is how I frame it because it works for me, is when I'm standing on that edge of discomfort, I know I'm just at the edge of a breakthrough.
Yeah.
So when you get comfortable with kind of that edge dwelling and jumping, and you do it enough times, again, it's a muscle that you grow, that you begin to realize, oh, I've been here so many times and I've always been taken care of. In some form or fashion, I have always been taken care of. I'm still here. And, so you're edge dwelling.
Yeah. That's what I'm doing. That's it.
Yeah. And building a stronger muscle. And another year from now, you will tell a different story that will serve so many other people too.
Yeah. Well, I know just looking back the last, 3 years, I can see how it's been a dynamic process, right? And it's continued to change along the way. So that's the other thing, is just waiting to see, so what's next, and being open to the changes, but still wanting to hold on to some new things that I have. And it's being open. Yeah.
So hang on to the things that you want to hang on to in very intentional ways, that, put them in your phone, keep them, visual to yourself, keep having conversations, prompt conversations. I think about it like it's like Christmas Day. And what you're doing is you're kind of pulling back the tissue paper of a package and you don't know what's in the box. And so if I hold that visualization in my head so much that, because I never know when I meet with somebody, what's going to show up and what's the gift that's going to come out of this conversation today? How am I going to be changed because of this conversation today? And I just know I'm going to be changed. And this conversation with you has woven me a little differently. So every conversation you start is going to weave people a little differently.
I like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess it's time to wrap up again.
Yeah, because as we're talking, of course, my mind goes to something else. I was reading another thought, and again, that's the way our conversations are. We could just
we could go for a long time. So I am curious, is there a thought that you want to leave the audience with today, or a new knowing that you have, or a book suggestion, something that could kind of wrap this up for our audience today?
Yeah, and again, like you just mentioned, Kale, I always come away from our discussions with something else. So that I really want to come back and draw to that intentionality that you were speaking of, about especially when in trauma or when in crisis. Or for me, it can be the grief triggers that I still deal with, where I'm at. And anyone who is living in the world of recovery has, if it's waiting for that phone call or wherever you're at in the journey, there's there. But really leaning into the idea and being intentional about asking myself as soon as I'm able to, what can I learn from this? How can I grow from this experience? And seeing it not as something that's happening to me, but it's just a happening that I get to learn from, grow from, and become better. That's a beautiful thought, to be able to ingrain that and have that be part of what I do. So I thank you for today. So.
Absolutely. Yes. That notion of life isn't happening to us, it's happening for us. It's powerful. So I appreciate that, Jim. Yeah. Okay. So tell our audience once again how they can get a hold of you and find out more about your story and find out what you're up to.
Sure. So my website is ZacharyHortonFoundation.org. So ZacharyHorton Foundation.org. And then, my email and phone numbers are all there. Podcasts that are there, recommended books and readings, and then just a lot about our story and what we continue to do in the recovery community. So
great. So people reach out to him. He is a jewel and a gem, and just an amazing, extraordinary light in the world in this space that tends to be dark. So thank you, Jim. Once again, I just am so delighted to have been introduced to you and to be able to spend some time with you. And I look forward to our time in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us in this episode. We hope this discussion gives you the empowerment you need during these challenging times. Remember, there is always light after darkness. For more inspiring conversations like this one, subscribe to the show at voicesencourage.com/podcast. We encourage you to share with your friends and family going through similar situations, so we can continue to build a strong community of hope and possibility. Start your life-changing journey today. Join our community at voicesencourage.com.